I think what's interesting about Jung's sort of psycho-architectural history, if you like, is that the prototypes, if you like, or the typologies of Bollingen, which you might consider as the cell, the castle, the tower, are all associated with very, very potent, what you might call animations, anima encounters. So I think that's, to me, rather enchanting how this other, in his case, say animal or feminine, is just present at these kind of key architectural moments as much as emotional moments.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marchiano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marchiano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, it's a wonderful treat to have two guests talking about Jung and towers, and Jung's analysand, Christiana Morgan, who was inspired by Jung's tower in Bollingen and built her own tower on the Marsh in Newburyport, Massachusetts. So let me tell you a little bit about Martin and about Hilary. Martin is an architect, and he's a former senior lecturer in England at the University of Bath, and he also holds a master's degree in Jungian studies from Essex University, and he's combined both of his incredible interests in architecture and Jung's tower and other places in Jung's life where architecture and a sense of place influenced Jung so strongly. And Jung's tower is a sort of an application of a lot of his ideas, the symbolic and the spiritual. He's given lots of lectures in Jungian communities around the world. And this book, which I'm about to mention, please order it, is the culmination of 12 years of work. It was the subject of his master's thesis and his PhD thesis. And it is absolutely fascinating and a unique contribution to the body of work about Jung because it deals with place, buildings, influences as a substrate of Jung's work. The name of the book is The Bollingen Tower, Constructing a Jungian Sense of Place by Martin Gledhill, spelled just like it sounds, and we'll put the title in the show notes. And we also have a friend from the past who has been on a podcast almost 2 years ago, Hilary Morgan, who came on to tell us about her grandmother's tower that I mentioned, Christiana Morgan's tower on the Marsh. Hilary is Christiana's granddaughter, and she is a filmmaker who has made a film well worth watching if you haven't done so already. You can see it online at www.towerofdreamsdoc.com. So look that up for sure. Hilary's made documentaries for many years, literally all over the world, for PBS and National Geographic. And this film, about the Tower on the Marsh, she made in 2019. Having had a long interest in her grandmother's work and the very unique aspects of her grandmother's tower. So we're going to see where all this conversation takes us. And Martin, I have lifted some things from your book. So here's what I'm thinking about. Everything that a building can be, a building can transform. The idea of psychic place and formative place. a real and imagined place, an archetypal place, a dream place. And you discuss all these multivalent aspects of Bollingen, von Franz's tower, the Morgan Tower in your book. So where do we start?
Probably by honouring Jung and Christiana, and von Franz as what a thing to do, to create this place that was more than a place, wasn't it, really? It was a kind of place of soul, place of the self for all of them in very different ways. But yeah, an incredible act, really. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Christiana. Thank you, Marie-Louise.
I'm remembering that you said, there were, in the book, about how there were all these stages of building the tower. And then in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's memoir, he talks about the stages as having begun with the idea of repose and renewal. And then in the first round tower that has the kitchen in it, very primitive, but that's the maternal hearth. And then an area later on, he kept adding to it, the area of retirement, a place where he could go by himself. And then finally a need for a larger space, so he constructed a courtyard and a loggia, which is sort of just outside but has a roof. Finally, at the very end, after his wife Emma had died, he put a top part on it that he said had to do with represented his ego personality. So this is a pretty psychological endeavor. It was never like what I imagine many people do when they just, build a house.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I feel really uncomfortable criticizing MDR, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think one of the key points that he makes, which is not a criticism, as a sort of honouring, is that the interpretations he makes, or Jaffe made, because probably that chapter was not written by Jung, occurred to him latterly. He wasn't working in the first instance, apart from maybe the first tower, from an overtly psychic manifesto. The patterns kind of emerged, you might say, naturally. I suppose which is the critical bit, why I find the MDR account a little bit problematic, is it's very brief. It conflates different stages, so you might say it's kind of inaccurate. But I think whenever we say something is, when you're working symbolically, I don't think we could say that. Do you know what I mean? That I think evokes, or, I know it sounds a bit pernickety, but I think maybe that's why he never spoke so extensively about the tower, that it's inexplicable in a sense, or it cannot be reduced, if you like, to this equals that. So that's my sense of MDR, but it's only actually 2 pages long, the description of the tower.
Well, and I think it's so interesting how the towers were places that were never complete. The whole sense that it's not a finished product, that it's something that sort of always perplexed me a great deal, because early on in researching the project, at least about my grandmother's tower, I read somewhere that Harry Murray, her partner of 40 years, he came to visit 2 years before he died, and as he walked up to the place, he said that the tower was a place that was never complete. It was always an ongoing, unfinished product. And having grown up next door to the tower in a rustic cabin and having visited a lot, I didn't really understand how it could be that a place that had so much work and seemed like a completed project to me was an ongoing, uncompleted building. And then I started to study Jung and then realized, it's a symbol for the individuation process, and that it's always ongoing, that one is always searching for wholeness, and that the similarity of the buildings and the psyche are parallel in that whole process.
Yeah, it's a really good point, isn't it? Because I suppose, the account in MDR positions the ego personality as, and I think he said something like, and I declared it complete, or, that was both geometrically, as a triangle, but also kind of psychologically. I'm not so sure Jung would have said that, actually, which is developing your point that it's complete at that moment,
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's a restless place, isn't it? It's a restless place in terms of its kind of spiritual ambience, but also its kind of architecture is utterly wonderfully iterative, isn't it? It's always added to, subtracted to. And I just love that about it.
Well, I was curious, too, to understand how you spoke about Bollingen being a wish and the tower being a plot. I was curious if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. This sounds really pretentious, but I'm going to say it anyway. That I think when I was writing the book, there was a point when I felt as it was writing itself. And so you get these kind of accidents of language. Plot just occurred to me. I mean, plot can be read as place, concept, but also a theatrical plot. And so I've lost the point that you made, Hilary. That
it was the quote about Bollingen being a wish and the tower being a plot.
Yeah, I'm not sure I remember writing that actually, but that I think I know that Jung's great-grandson, Daniel Baumann, who has been very helpful, and I share his conviction. I think Jung always wanted a tower. He was always wishing for a tower. Right from his youth, his building games. So I think it was embodied in him. But I think that the plot aspect of it does a little bit come out in the house, what I call the house dream, but I think, Debs, you call the two skull dreams, that it's a story that's adapted and it's sort of keeping track with the tower. So I have this slight sense that the tower is suggesting, if you sort of personify the tower, if you like, is suggesting ideas and work, and Jung sort of feeding back and sort of plotting its kind of evolution. Does that make any sense? That there's you wouldn't say it's not as stark as curating it, but I think he's very alert to accidents and he sort of configures them into his work and into that place. The classic one is what I call the filament stone, the accident of the arrival of the cube. So I think it is constructed in the widest sense. Does that make sense? That it's narrated, it's constructed, and retrospectively, MDR is part of that construction, which can be...
Oh, that's interesting. That the MDR construction about the tower, the story of the tower, it is constructed, just as the tower was constructed, but not in an entirely sort of cerebral or planned way. It kept adding to itself in a way like a dream. And I just want to fill in for listeners the reference to Jung's dream that, in my association with Jungians, we always call it the two skulls dream. And in the index, it's called something altogether different, which really made me laugh about it. They call it the multi-storied house, which is in fact what it is. And the dream is that he's in the upper story of a living room, basically, with fine old pieces in a Rococo style with oil paintings and so on. And Jung, as the dreamer, thinks to himself, not bad. Then he decides to go down a floor. Let's see what that looks like. And down he goes. And that's a story that dated from the 15th or 16th century with medieval furnishings and red brick floors. And then he says to himself in the dream, oh gosh, now I've really got to go look at what's in the rest of the house. He comes on a heavy door. He goes down another stair. There's stone and brick and so on. And then he's at a level that dated back where the walls dated from Roman times. So he says, well, now my interest was intense. And he looks even more closely, and he sees that on the floor, there is a stone slab with a ring to lift it. And again, a stairway, but this time very narrow stone steps and a low cave. And there on a dirt floor, very, very old, are two human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated, and he awoke. And so thinking about Jung's life, how he rendered some of these ideas into actuality with Bollingen, that it links the above, the towers that go up, with what the depths of Psyche, even though the house itself does not contain a basement because it's so close to Lake Zurich.
Yeah, again, this is a hypothesis. Well, who can say about truth? But I think the discovery of the Napoleonic soldier, the skeleton, is wonderfully serendipitous, isn't it? Because it does add that forgotten layer. And actually, when you go into the first tower, the ground floor is quite different to the upper floor. It's almost grading. And he admits, doesn't he, that even as they were building it, they were moving beyond the primitive, if you like. But I think it's just how wonderful that, you might say, forgotten events somehow surfaced to kind of cooperate with his dreams. So that's one point. The second point, Freud interpreted the dream as a sort of death wish, and that death wish Jung sort of camouflaged by suggesting that it was towards Emma and her sister Gret, because that was during the period of marital difficulties. But actually, he was thinking, I'm beginning to diverge from Freud. So who can say what a dream sounds? But he does adapt that dream a lot. There's 4 versions of it. And then in the last telling in Man and His Symbols, it's changed quite a lot, which, that's not my idea. I can't remember the lady who wrote the paper, but a really nice paper on that kind of ongoing process.
That's so interesting. It's exactly like Bollingen, that this dream changes as he goes along. And it's true that dreams are not static. What we recall and what it means and the current version fits. And somebody could say, yes, but that's not what you said the first time.
Yeah.
So many years ago. And we said, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's not what I said. And Bollingen is really evidence of that in stone, of what comes next.
Yeah. I suppose I'm kind of interested in and this is a point that Andreas Jung has touched on in his really lovely book about Kusnacht, how you can see the two homes as a kind of split pair, or a kind of reductive view of two personalities, or a continuum, because I think that Kusnacht was so modified by the act of an architect, never employ an architect.
But you're an architect, Martin.
I know, never employ an architect. That there was a kind of deficit. Some of the early drawings of Kusnacht are quite similar to the tower in many ways. And so there's this kind of deficit that is kind of satiated in Bollingen. But I just love the idea of them as a continuum rather than family home retreat, which is the kind of normal.
So we might say, I'm stretching what you've said, that Kusnacht, which was the family home, all very proper, very large. You can take tours through it. Now it's a proper upper class kind of home versus Bollingen, which is much more primitive, all the towers, that they correspond to his number 1 and number 2 personalities, which Jung talks about, that his ego personality is one thing, but he has this old, unconscious,
sort of archaic, isn't it?
Archaic expression that is also a huge part of him.
Yeah, I mean, just to develop that, I think they, as I say, sort of cooperate. But Kusnacht was finished when I forget the dates, kind of, 1907 or something. And so, yeah, my main point is there's this kind of deficit that somehow Kusnacht has been adapted. It's probably under quite considerable influence from Emma. And so the dream, how interesting that the dream appears at a point that he would say that gives him his sort of his divergence from Freud, but actually is giving him a kind of signal for this other place. I mean, other literally with a capital O.
Well, it's interesting that Kusnacht still has a tower. Didn't he work that out with there was a little bit of conflict with his architect, but he still insisted on the tower that is the main feature when you first walk up.
Well, at one stage it had two towers.
Oh.
But the original drawings show this kind of grading from a kind of what you'd call rusticated, very lumpy stones, to this kind of Baroque volutes on the... And these are Jung's sketches. But it's been, I don't know the word, but it's been sort of gentrified. It's quite polite. I think it's a wonderful house, but it's quite polite. Whereas, Bollingen is more unfettered, really, isn't it? It's sort of quite visceral in a sense.
Well, and I find interesting that in Kusnacht with the tower, it's actually where the patients would come up to see him, that you come in the front door and you hit the stairs and you wind up the tower to go to the waiting room and to his office. So it's interesting that was the placement of it, I think.
Yeah, well, there's a rather delightful comparison between Freud's study and Jung's, their therapy spaces. The therapy spaces at Berghaus are away from the family. There's, they're kind of split from the family. They're obviously in the same apartment, but you don't go through the family. Whereas to an extent, that climb, that spiral, that ascent in Kusnacht is kind of through the family. I know there's a glass, there's a frosted screen between them, but how wonderful the difference. The difference is architectural as much as intellectual. And actually, Kusnacht is about 4, maybe 5 times the size of Freud's house, Freud's apartment. So, a kind of house envy, if you like.
Well, I think it's also interesting how Jung's Bollingen seems so much more inspired by his dreams. For Christiana, she did have a vision of a long white column, and that Jung described as sort of a yin, a phallic symbol, and then next to it was this Poseidon or Neptune, very small figure that her animus, or, the leader to the underworld. She was then, as far as Jung was saying, he felt that she needed to kind of emerge, to ascend out of the depths to this place, and that she needed to lose herself by this column, and which ultimately meant to find herself. But I don't think, in the readings that I've done of hers, I don't see too much reference to that. There, to me, it was more the creation of the tower that she and Harry built, I think, was inspired more by Harry visiting Jung in Kusnacht for 3 weeks. And while he was there, this was like 1925, while he was there, Jung apparently took him to Bollingen. And when he came back, he told Christiana about it. And that was the prime inspiration for their building the tower.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful point, actually, that I found myself wrestling between Deirdre Baer's account of Murray visiting in 1925, which I'm sure you'll be much more correct, or Claire Douglas's says he visited Bollingen in the mid-30s. But that's quite important because I think it's a lovely point that he's influenced by Kusnacht, but I was wrestling with how influenced they were by Bollingen. And of course, across that time period, in 1925, it would have just been one tower.
Uh-huh.
In the mid-30s, it would have had certainly the second tower, the spiritual tower, but also probably the courtyard. So I know it sounds like a moot point, but what did he see? What did he see? We won't know. We don't know.
Well, and Christiana also, first, when I was making this film, I interviewed the builder's son, and he had some very rough sketches. They're in the film. But working with the architectural historian in our group, he was actually able to go to the architectural firm that helped build the tower and found actual blueprints. So what we originally thought was just kind of Harry and Christiana and Kenneth Knight, the builder, coming up with sketches to create this tower. It now turns out that they actually did hire professional architects.
Yeah, because I think Kenneth Knight's son in your lovely film says, I don't think there was an architect involved, which is a sort of red herring. I mean, maybe they just did the original scheme, but those are really useful, those drawings, and you were very kind in sharing them. Because the first two floors are half the height of the final thing. So there's a kind of sort of thing architects do, they sort of set up proportioning systems and things. So, they're an absolute gift, aren't they, to begin some interpretation, I suppose.
Uh-huh.
Is that right? The study, the thalamus of the mind, I think you called it, and I think it's twice the height, isn't it?
It is much higher, but I think that given the proportions, I mean, the first cabin that they built, which is now called the main room or the great room, extends straight out to the beginning of the tower, which is the level of the bedroom. So I think there was a certain constraint with the geography. And then they had to dynamite out the bottom floor, the meditation room. And I think wanting that sort of low because it was sort of a cave-like, the symbol of the unconscious, the place of rituals and meditation. And then, as you say, the last floor being the thalamus, it is a domed roof, and it is much taller. So what I found interesting about when you were talking about the four and its symbol of spatial unity, the tower as it stands now is 3 rooms. But then in the top floor, the study, the thalamus, there is a metal ladder that leads up to the roof. And you were sort of saying that rooftop was really probably a 4th element to the architecture. And what I wanted to add to you about that is that when they first designed the tower, they were going to make that into an observatory. So it actually would have been a 4th, interestingly. Yeah. And in my studying, more recently, the kind of layout of the tower, I've realized that it actually does, as separate components, have 4 elements. It's a quadrant. And that you have the tower itself as 1. You have the cabin or the great room attached to it as 2. And then she added a kitchen and then what we now call the sunroom, which was very similar to the loggia, which was originally open. It didn't have the pane glass windows it has now. It was open to the outside. But that those are 4 separate elements. So there again, a 4th was created as far as the structural unity of the place. It's amazing. Just the symbolism and the thought that went into absolutely everything that went on. It's really extraordinary.
And I'm thinking about the correspondence between Jung's dream of, ego and modernity on the more or less top floor, down to this primitive basement, the unconscious, and what Jung did in Bollingen there was a room there that was only for him, of his own place for unconscious ruminations. And then the Morgan Tower.
He painted the paintings on the walls.
Yes,
Yep.
and he painted the paintings. It was of, and then the Morgan Tower with her study at the top of the tower for the intellectual ego work, which Jung finally said, however accurate it is, that he added last at the tower. But that we go, the symbolism of top to bottom, ego to psyche, carries through with intention, but also it seems like it's just psychic reality that this is, of course, the way it should be.
I think what we can develop out of that, and I know I would say this as an architect, I think the correspondence between the needs of the moment and practical constraint are not the enemy of psychic intent. Do you know what I mean? That the idea that we're going to be symbolic and everything else just goes out the window. I just love the idea of them. They needed a kitchen, didn't they? So Christiana's, Jung was playing cat and mouse with the children, just trying to get away from everyone. So the needs of the moment gave birth to something enchanting, I suppose.
Yeah, it's so much union of so many opposites of the rational need for planning with an architect part of it, and constructing a place that is a home, for your soul. That this is my creation. This is what mirrors me, and the above and the below, and the interior and exterior. There's so many dualities, Kusnacht and Bollingen, that get unified through the tower. And I'm aware we haven't talked about the interiors of the Morgan Tower. We see what's outside, but the interior, I think, is astonishing. And you know more about what's on the interior of Bollingen, but visitors are not permitted in that part of the building.
Yeah, the inside of Christiana's is the photographs that you've very kindly shared, Hilary. It's a total work of art, isn't it?
It is they say the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is a total piece of art. Yeah, she married the architecture of the building to the architectural landscape and the sculptures and artwork she did inside all together to create one universal piece that speaks together as one art.
I think I've always been enchanted by the resonance between is it Lachaise, the sculpture of that.
Oh, say what that is, Hilary, so people don't know the sculpture.
They commissioned Gaston Lachaise to do a sculpture. First, it began as a bust of Christiana, and then it extended down to, I guess, her waist, and then eventually down to her thighs. And they were actually hoping to do a full statue, but he was preparing for a retrospective at the Metropolitan in New York, so he had to stop. But they have this beautiful sculpture of Christiana nude done, and it would sit in the gardens of the tower in the summertime, and then that was brought downstairs into the meditation room in the winter.
But I think I've never seen it, but from the photographs that I have seen, it's a beautiful thing. But I suppose the echo, if that's the word, or the reflection in Philemon. So in the upper floor of the tower, this painting of Philemon, which is also in the Red Book, this huge winged figure standing over the bed. This contrast between this kind of imaginary figure, shall we say, this loving figure, and this other figure, the figure of Christiana. I love that speaking, if you like, between the two.
Well, the tower was, an exploration and a place to reconnect to the feminine and to nature and to instincts. And that was a lot of what she felt, as if she was, moving past what she called her inherited religion or culture, which was Christianity, which had done so much to dogmatic with its beliefs and repression of the feminine and the sensuality of the body, that she was there to undo.
Yeah, so beautifully, and in some senses tragically, I guess. Yeah, just these two figures that kind of are emblems. I mean, Bollingen is dedicated to Philemon, shrine to Philemon, repentance for Faust. This, and I think it's, what I think he's trying to say there is it's kind of anti-modern, but I don't think it is anti-modern. It's very easy to read it as medieval and kind of historicist. I think when you look at it architecturally, it's very clever, but also its attitude is kind of transmodern in a sense that it assimilates psychic material rather than just material.
Are we possibly veering into the dangerous territory of masculine and feminine?
We might do, and I'm a bit outnumbered. So
Feeling a little anxious about where these two women might go?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go with it.
Okay. But I am thinking, you use the word medieval, and there is a sort of medieval solidity, even stolidity to Bollingen from my perspective. And Christiana Morgan's tower is somehow much more accessible and open, and has a lightness to it of that, and that first vision, which is right there in the film, and so uplifting. That first vision, when I saw the tower, I just gasped. Of that, there it was, just rising on the bank of the river in a spirit of, I don't know, just a kind of openness versus the closedness of Bollingen.
Yeah, the painting that Hilary mentioned, the luminous column,
Yes.
it absolutely captures that spirit of emergence, but with a delicacy and a luminosity as much as a luminosity, isn't it? I don't know. I don't think it splits neatly, does it? But it is quite stolid, and actually, von Franz's tower is even more so. But then it's relieved by beautiful touches of the mandala over the fireplace. So I think they both. Well, that would be the syzygy, that kind of transit between two energies, I suppose. Sorry, just don't want to hog the point, but I think what's interesting about Jung's sort of psycho-architectural history, if you like, is that the prototypes, if you like, or the typologies of Bollingen, which you might consider as the cell, the castle, the tower, are all associated with very, very potent, what you might call animations, anima encounters. The young girl at Brother Klaus's cell, his association with Emma's mother on the banks of the Rhine, where there's this. So I think that's, to me, rather enchanting how this other, in his case, say animal or feminine, is just present at these kind of key architectural moments as much as emotional moments. There's some very lovely drawings of both Kusnacht and Bollingen by Sabi Tauber, she and her husband were friends of Jung and Jung's. And she draws the tower as though it's got a big spiral staircase. But she's drawing the tower, she's not drawing Kusnacht. And she also draws a picture of arrival through this, it's almost like Merlin's hut, in the wood. And I think they absolutely capture the spirit of it and transcend, the kind of solid and delicate or solid and effete. Does that make sense? That her imagination is adapted it somehow. They're really lovely drawings, or paintings, really.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting about Christiana's was the sort of private language of symbols that she and Harry set up. That even in the gardens, there were these paths that they would build, and they would line them with statuary and inscriptions. They planted all the trees and gave names to the various parts of the garden and to each major tree that was in the garden. They had like Bollingen Circle and Guardian Hill and Via Sacra and Gorte's Brow, and they would, ritualize these places, and everything was symbolic. Everything represented something of the knowledge and what they'd learned, of their journey into their psyche, which was so profound. And then throughout the tower, it's the same way with her carvings and the artifacts that she placed, the paintings on the walls. It was so meticulously thought out. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a kind of, in some sense, it's a kind of animism, isn't it? The sort of animating of the natural as well as the artistic world. I mean, Jung, in his letters, he talks about many of the carvings at Bollingen as being emergent. They weren't carved into the stone, they emerged from the stone. So I'm really fascinated about, this is kind of unfinished work of analytical psychology, psyche and matter, that, it kind of rhymes with the kind of ecological issues, that the stone is alive, it just breathes slower sort of thing.
Well, and you bring that wonderful part about the Jung being connected to the arts and crafts movement, of the alignment of the head and the heart and the hand in the creation of connecting psyche and matter with creating, which is really beautiful. Yeah, it's really gorgeous.
So, yeah, it's just utterly enchanting and really difficult, trying to kind of navigate through these things.
I find myself going back to all these dualities, so I'm adding a couple more of Jung's carvings on the outside of Bollingen. There's a bear, and I forget what else. I'm sure you know them all by heart, Martin.
There's a horse with a mare who's being milked by a woman.
Yeah, and of all the things, why that? But Psyche, that's what emerged. I remember reading something about Michelangelo saying that he just released the forms that were already within the marble. But, and I'm thinking about Christiana Morgan's carvings. I mean, they are remarkable throughout her tower and in the main room, the great room, of that she learned to carve in wood. And there's one up above the bed with script. It is remarkable, but that here is the interior was such a focus for her, and for Jung with the loggia and the inscriptions of family heraldic structures. That's all on the outside.
Yeah, that's partly, yeah, maybe, but I think the spiritual tower is, as far as I know, I've never been into it, is entirely surrounded in paintings. And the upper floor of the first tower has these two significant paintings, Emily's Star and Philemon. And there are quite a lot of other moments that are added. So I the more famous ones are on the outside, but
let me amend what I said, that it's a private structure.
Yeah.
With the paintings are for him and maybe a select few, whereas the Morgan Tower has an openness to it, and it's all very visible and can be shared. And then the other contrast I'm thinking about is Bollingen was for Jung. it was his retreat. And he said, that there was nowhere where he was more fully himself than when he was there at Bollingen alone. Whereas the Morgan Tower was built for two people, Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan, to carry Jung's work, they hoped, forward by translating it into an interpersonal relationship.
Yeah, it's a really lovely point, isn't it? That two-ness, it's not a division, it's a union. I suppose it's not really contradicting that, but I think because Bollingen was also a holiday home, well, actually so was Christiana's, Jung had to navigate with kind of intruders, didn't he, if you like, either family intruders or, kind of visitors. So it probably wasn't quite as vigorously introverted as kind of history records. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But I get the sense that it was quite a lot going on there. And a second point, and I got very little basis to say this, I've often wondered about Tony Wolff's involvement in the tower, because the photograph on Nan Savage Healy's lovely book about her has the two of them standing together. But in actual fact, those are two photographs that have been put together. But the point still stands that at the height of their relationship and collaboration, perhaps not the relationship, but the collaboration, that's when the tower's coming. So kind of what was her, it's been edited out, isn't it, from MDR and from the rest of it.
Yeah, it felt to me from your book as if Jung's Bollingen was much more of an evolution, that as you said, he started it with Tony. It became a very private place. He took only certain people there for a while. The children came along, and then Emma started to begin to like it. So she came, the children came. There was the building of the annex on top for the children's bedrooms to accommodate them. But then there was a spiritual tower. And so it seemed like it evolved, and it was many things in his life and in his family. Whereas Christiana's tower was very much a place that she built for her and Harry. And then I think most of the time she was there by herself. But that Harry did come. And similar just one little detail that I thought was so interesting in your book, you talked about how Jung would put up a yellow flag signaling for people not to come. Well, oddly, Christiana did the same thing with a red flag. With a black flag. We knew when the black flag was flying that we were not to come close. And because we had a separate building, we never did intrude in the same way that his children were there living. So she kept it much more separate.
What's funny about the flag thing is that in the English sensibility, to fly a flag shows you're at home. But actually, he was saying, I kind of am at home, but keep out, so it's kind of sort of flipped somehow. Yeah, I think, I agree. I think architecturally and almost in terms of its inhabitation, Christiana's tower is kind of, if you could use the word, purer, isn't it? Bollingen is always fighting with itself. It's fighting for privacy. It's a battleground, basically, which is psychic as much as familial, isn't it, somehow?
Say more about that Bollingen is always fighting with itself. That fits with my experience of having been there, but I never thought about it in those terms before.
Well, it's only just kind of been given to me, actually, from above. I think that essentially Jung is always trying to re-establish his privacy and his innerness, isn't he? So originally the kids camped outside, and presumably he and maybe Emma slept upstairs. And then, the spiritual tower reasserts that. And then the fifth story is always trying to get away. So he's trying to get away. So that's a kind of emotive response. I mean, architecturally, it's always flipping between the kind of contingent, what you might call vernacular or free form, and the kind of statements, the square or the circle. So, and as a result of that, he and his son Franz were always struggling to resolve really complicated junctions, which would be complicated enough architecturally if they didn't have a psychic kind of intent on top of that. Does that make sense? So there's this kind of psychic intent, this familial intent, and a kind of architectural problem, if you know.
To see if this feels like it might be kind of a accurate reflection. Bollingen, and maybe the Morgan Tower as well, but Bollingen in particular, the lifelong or attempt over many years to reconcile opposites of these dualities of Kusnacht versus Bollingen, all the things we've talked about. And now we're adding another one of the private retreat for Jung alone and family, the place where family could come. And that some of these, I think it's just so very human that we don't just resolve these dualities once and for all of like, oh, good, no more inner conflict, but continuing to wrestle with the opposites in so many ways. And I'm thinking for Christiana Morgan of some of those same opposites, a place for her alone, place for her and Harry, and you, family members, lived right next door. Fortunately, Kusnacht is a good ways away from Bollingen, but you were in a passel of grandkids who loved the tower and wanted to climb up that ladder and get up on the roof.
Mm.
And so she had a flag that said, keep out.
The black flag, yeah.
Or the black car, which meant that Harry was there visiting. And then in later years, she built a fence, actually, a wooden fence. So the messages got stronger and stronger. Yeah, but throughout the duality of the secular and sacred, the unconscious, conscious, the primitive, it's there's such profound places. And I love that that Jung even wrote Christiana about keeping her tower primitive as well, that it was necessary not to disturb the spirits of nature, that was an integral part, that to keep it such that there was no electricity, no running water, that, to stay warm, you'd build a fire, and that was a way to keep it close to the instincts.
Yeah, and he talks about the breaking the ground, which actually was quite violent, wasn't it? The explosive of the rock, the great rock, releasing essentially spirits, isn't it? Which, where do they just, are they just exiled, or they just come back into the fabric? They belong there. That's their home as much as Christiana and Harry's home. It's a really lovely letter, that, isn't it? When he's talking about sharing the process of building, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the story that the builder's son, David, who I interview in the film, I don't think it's in the film, but he talked about after the dynamite went off, he was about 6 at the time, he climbed down where the rubble was and he discovered this really huge, large black snake. And I found that pretty astounding because of all the summers growing up playing there, I don't remember coming across any large black snake. So that seemed like an interesting symbol of...
Yeah, that kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but that kind of animal spirit that belongs there, and, snake, what a wonderful, how Jungian, if you like, I think Jung was also chasing away the public. I think that's really why the courtyard wall was built, because, I've been guilty of this, of going past on a boat and trying to get in. So at the height of his fame, he would have been pestered continually, I would have thought.
And he had some really interesting and odd experiences at Bollingen. I'm wondering if there are corollaries with the Morgan Tower of, you mentioned the Napoleonic soldier. And his daughter, when he was building the tower, said, "Oh my gosh, you're not going to build something here, are you? There's so many dead people around." And when they started to do the building, they found the skeleton of a Napoleonic soldier that his daughter had sensed was there. And Jung gave that skeleton a proper formal burial ceremony. And then there are the times that he heard people singing outside the tower. And he'd open a window and there was nothing there. And then go back and presumably sit down and hear these spirits playing music and singing. The psyche enters in these ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, as ever, under the guise of scientism, I suppose, he in a sense, tries to explain that, and he observes that because that a tributary of the the James Way, runs near the tower. And I think he suggests that mercenaries were using that route. But there's another story where he hears, I think he describes it as a polyphony, multiple sounds of the nature and essentially singing. I mean, what an enchanting, rhyming with Hilary's point about the garden being alive. I must admit, when I was sitting there once, and this I'm sure this could be explained away if we wanted to, but there was a bee that was distracting, and he talks about bees quite a lot. It was distracting, and I was kind of intrigued by this bee, as though something had disturbed the place. And secondly, the water was lapping in, but there were no boats around, so there was nothing that had, and it was, I just remember thinking there's something insisting and something disturbed. And I don't know, I just remember that phenomena, I suppose you'd call them.
So, Hilary, I'm wondering, given Jung's very interesting experiences at Bollingen, whether your grandmother, Christiana, ever reported any special, interesting, out of the ordinary experiences at her tower.
I don't remember. I was 12 when she died, so I don't remember anything being described. I know, there was so much that seemed so spiritual and unusual to me. Well, it didn't seem that unusual as a child, but the ritual burning of the cuttings every year was done on a particular year. Just everything was ritualized and had symbols to it. So, yeah, it was really special and unique that way.
And nothing that ever happened for you in you personally? I'm hoping for some magic here.
I know. I don't remember. I don't remember at this point. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I do remember as having magic to it is this ladder at the top floor of the tower, which is just a metal ladder attached to the wall. It couldn't be more rudimentary. And that you and your siblings and cousins would climb up there and go on the roof, and she let you. And in today's world, kids would not be allowed up there.
No, and what was especially fun about it is if she was sitting at her desk working, we had to be very quiet. And because it was such a tall, very thin ladder, it was very challenging to get up and to stay quiet. And then you had to push really hard on the door to get it open. So it was a particularly mysterious and fun thing to be able to have to do. Yeah, we really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another way of these edges that get traversed from the ordinary to what is edgy, whether it's sort of psychic or the edginess of climbing that narrow little ladder up to a place that was dangerous. And of course, as towers do, there's visibility, which is one of the great advantages of towers, is to be able to see far and wide. But Martin, I know you had an experience in and with Jung's tower where you were a little abducted by Psyche, as it were.
Yeah. No, just before developing that, when Hilary was talking, I was thinking of, Jung and the attic at Kleinhunigen, and the mannequin. The attic, as you say, the above is a place of illumination as much as the below, isn't it? So he traverses both those worlds. But yeah, my experience is deeply embarrassing, actually.
Oh, by all means, tell us.
I was looking at what's called Jung's room, which is in the upstairs of the first tower. And I can still see to this day in my mind a mandala, which is in the Red Book, and it's called the Golden Fortress. It's essentially a fort, a star fort, really. Anyway, so I wrote about that and was probably a bit pleased with myself that I'd spotted it and the rest of it. And then I've got to know this lovely guy in America, Jim Givens, who's really drawn a huge amount of the tower. And in doing that, he had found a picture of that room that showed a very different painting, Amelie's. And so I suppose you could explain it away by carelessness. But I suppose it's true that I really wanted to see it, and I saw it. And of course, that means that there's a bit of the book that's basically wrong. But hey, that little trickster has sort of come in.
But it reminds me very much of Jung's trip to Ravenna in Italy.
Yeah.
Where he saw, and I think he was with Tony, both of them saw in the basement of a basilica, if I've got this right.
It's in the baptistry, the Neonian baptistry, yeah.
No, they both saw 4 walls of mosaics having to do with water. And biblical scenes, or at least some of them were biblical scenes. And they were smitten by these incredible mosaics. And it was a very special experience. And when Jung got back to Switzerland, he remembered them. They had impressed him so much that he wrote to the mayor or governing official of the town and said, would you, if there are pictures of them, please send me the pictures. We remember them. They're very special. And the response was, there are no mosaics like that anywhere in Ravenna, and certainly not in this building.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. And I think he says something like, I was convinced that something that is inside can be outside, and something that is outside can be inside, that traffic. I spent, at the university's expense, actually, a few days in Ravenna to try and get to the bottom of this. And lower down in the baptistry, there's a series of niches, 4 niches, that have partial Latin inscriptions. And some of those kind of align with the subject matter of the visions. Not trying to say the visions were devalued in any way, but I think what's enchanting is that atmosphere and those prompts produced these images for them. Now, some critics say that Jung was getting confused, and he admits, I think, to Hull, the curator of the collected works, that he was confused. But I prefer to believe that they saw, something manifested.
Yeah, I like that way of saying it so simply and yet profoundly, which what is on the inside can be outside. And I prefer to believe that you saw that painting in that room in Bollingen.
Well, that would be helpful, because I wouldn't have to revise the book. But why I was so convinced is I remember looking at the pinholes where it had been transferred from the book to the wall. So I wasn't just, whipping by it. So it's how wonderful that place can, appear seems too reductive, but emerge, I suppose.
I'm thinking, my way of sort of summing up our conversation, if such a topic can ever be summed up, which it can't, but is how profound the rendering of Psyche in art, in carving, in stone can be, that it really does become infused with, what do we call it? A different reality. That these buildings are very magical. And what Christiana Morgan and Jung invested in their towers is a spirit that moves us even to the point of being able to see something that in ordinary reality isn't there. But they are images of spirit and soul and depth and dualities, and they affect us.
Yeah, beautifully put. That kind of resonance, isn't it? Which can be difficult as well as beatific, can't it? We are affected by place in a modern world where we're disaffected by place.
Mm-hmm. It goes to the theme of the alchemists who are trying to find spirit in matter, and architects who create something out of matter that then becomes a home, a dwelling place for spirit. And these special occurrences, these places that can affect us, they have connections to other realities that we don't always experience.
Yeah, and as you say, sort of this beautiful journey into one's psyche. And as Martin, I thought you so beautifully talked about the using the word totem, a totem of individuation, that it was the embodiment of this, which I thought was so beautifully placed.
Thank you. Yeah, no, as you were both talking, I was thinking of it's the word scintillae, these kind of sparks. You get these kind of flashes that are just, a cynic can explain away, but I prefer to at least inhabit something that's enchanted, not in a kind of floppy sense, but just is animated, enchanted.
Oh, well, thank you both for coming on and sharing
Thank you.
your work and experiences and history with all of us out there.
Thank you. No, it's a beautiful ideas that settle, don't they, and emerge. But thank you very much for the invite.
And I think we can all find places that are so special to us, where we can be so deeply and creatively ourselves. So let us wish that for all of you out there, and certainly for you, Hilary, and you, Martin.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, that was really beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.